Hello, good morning. So today is chapter 5 of The Big Question. The title is called Darwin and Evolution, the supreme demonstration of the irreconcilability of science and religion. The leading new atheist Richard Dawkins presents Darwin as an atheist apologist who demolished the credibility of theism. The subtitle of Darwin's influential work, The Blind Watchmaker, emphasizes one of his core themes: why the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. For Dawkins, Darwin marks a turning point in the history of the public square. While aggressively anti-scientific religious fundamentalists who do not share this extremist ideologies. In this chapter, we will explore the question of Darwin's theory of evolution, looking at its historical development and its contemporary statements of how it might impact on religious beliefs. Let's begin by setting the context for Darwin's ideas. The 19th century was a period of scientific advance in many Western nations, especially Great Britain. Many of these new insights called into question long-standing assumptions about the nature of the world which had shaped cultural attitudes. Science works with the available evidence. Some histories of science create the impression that earlier generations were backward looking because they thought the sun went around the earth in 1300 or failed to realize the earth was at least millions of years old in 1700. This is clearly unfair. Science rests upon the interpretation of evidence, and the evidence for these beliefs that most now take for granted was not available at those times. In the late 18th century, a growing consensus developed within scientific circles that the Earth was much older than had previously been assumed. Geologists were beginning to uncover evidence that life forms that were now extinct had once inhabited the Earth. Gradually, these ideas began to percolate downward into popular culture. Although there was suspicion about the notion of an ancient Earth, especially during the 1830s, the idea gradually gained popular support, not at least on account of the public fascination with dinosaurs. The term dinosaur was invented in 1842 by the paleontologist Sir Richard Owen to refer to large reptile-like primitive animals that were then extinct, whose skeletons had been unearthed in the previous 30 years. Owen commissioned a set of full-size sculptures of dinosaurs for the Great Exhibition in London's Crystal Palace in 1854. This collection of models of various extinct Mesozoic reptiles included a reconstruction of their original environment, complete with an artificial lake with islands. They caused a sensation and were widely seen as the most memorable feature of the exhibition. This growing awareness of the antiquity of the Earth was accompanied by speculation about how biological life forms developed. In the first half of the 19th century, terms such as progressionism and transmutation began to be used to refer to the view that life forms had changed over geological time. Many German biologists conceived of life evolving according to some set of predetermined laws analogous to the way in which an embryo develops in the womb. As early as 1794, um, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, outlined a theory of the succession of life forms through successive adaptations. The fossil record suggested, although his interpretation was disputed, a progressive emergence of higher forms of life. Some interpreted this in terms of a series of special divine creations following the publication of vestiges of the natural history of creation. This emergence began to be formulated in terms of a purposeful and progressive transformation within nature, guided by some basic developmental principles ultimately grounded in divine providence. The phenomenon of what we could now call evolution was increasingly accepted by about 1850, with a number of theories emerging to account for its specific features, most notably the transformist model developed decades earlier by the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. These approaches met with some resistance on both religious and scientific grounds, yet the most significant opposition in England to Lamarck's theory of evolution seems to have been political. Lamarck's theory was initially seen as associated with dangerous continental radicalism, both political and religious. The memory of the violence of the French Revolution was still fresh in England at the time. Gradually, this unhelpful perception weakened as the idea of biological evolution came to be reframed in terms of reform and progress, two core values of the Victorian age. Religious hostility toward any notion of biological transformism emanated from a number of sources. One of the most interesting was William Paley's Natural Theology, which declared that the complexity of biological structures such as the human eye was evident of divine contrivance, that is, design and construction. Paley used the image of a watch to make his point. Its intricate mechanism showed clear evidence of design and construction. Natural complexity, Paley argued, could not have arisen through chance. It was a witness to divine design. Yet by 1850, Paley's influence had dwindled as scientific evidence of biological development began to make its mark. It is interesting to note that Dawkins' blind watchmaker is specifically aimed against Paley's approach, which Dawkins seems to think is representative of Christianity as a whole. It is not. Dawkins' strongly negative assessment of the religious implications of Darwinism actually depends on depicting a local historical contingency as if it were a universal theological necessity. Paley's approach, including the controlling image of the watch, is firmly located in the scientific and cultural world of the early 18th century. By the middle of the 19th century, early Christianity had moved on, developing more sophisticated approaches to the manner in which the natural world displayed signs of a creator. Dawkins makes a superb case for abandoning Paley. Sadly, he seems to think this also entails abandoning God. By 1850, most British intellectuals were receptive to the notion of biological evolution, but what mechanism lay behind it? What theory could be advanced to explain how the evolution of species took place? Lamarck's transformist account of evolution seemed increasingly acceptable to many in Victorian England, despite its lingering associations with French political radicalism. It was easily assimilated to an ethos of self-improvement in which the characteristics of animals develop in response to environmental challenges. Charles Darwin is therefore to be remembered not for demonstrating the phenomenon of biological evolution, although he unquestionably amplified its scope, but for offering a theory of the way in which this process took place. In what follows, we shall look at some aspects of this theory. A full treatment of Darwin's theory of evolution would consider the slow development of his ideas and show how they gradually fell into place. For our limited purposes in this chapter, we shall focus on the three leading themes of this new understanding of the phenomenon of biological evolution set out on the origin of species. The principle of variation. Variation arises among individuals within any given population, for example, in relation to their physical structures. The principle of heredity. Offspring resemble their parents more than they resemble unrelated individuals. The principle of selection. Some forms of life are more successful at surviving and reproducing than other forms in any given environment. Darwin thus thinks of evolution as a sorting process within nature which filters out certain forms of life through differential reproduction. Darwin named this process natural selection. Let's look at this approach in more detail. A scientific theory aims to explain what is observed. What did Darwin believe needed to be explained? On the origin of species, identifies a number of observations that Darwin believed were not satisfactorily accounted for by existing theories of evolution, such as Lamarck's transformism and Paley's theory of special divine creation. A good example is the observation that many creatures have what are known as vestigial structures or rudimentary structures, which have no obvious function, such as the nipples of male animals or wings on many flightless birds. How could these be explained on the basis of Paley's theory, which stressed the importance of the individual's design of species? Why should God design redundancies? The core of Darwin's theory is the notion of natural selection. Darwin invented the term natural selection to refer to a hypothesis of a hypothetical process within nature which was analogous to the process of artificial selection used by breeders of cattle or pigeons. Darwin began to study pigeons in March 1855, trying to understand how breeders were able to develop new characteristics such as neck ruffles. He came to see that these breeds of pigeons had all developed from a common ancestor, the so-called rock pigeon. If humans were able to bring about such change in pigeons over hundreds of years, might there be some analogous process operating within nature, acting over much longer times, which might bring about comparable changes? Very similar ideas were developed around the same time by Alfred Wallace, who helped Darwin develop aspects of this theory in the late 1850s. Darwin and Wallace presented their evolutionary ideas together at a meeting of the Linnean Society in July 1858. Although their presentations do not seem to have led to any significant interest developing the question, while Darwin and Wallace developed very similar ideas of natural selection in the late 1850s, there are some significant divergences between them. These are often differences of emphasis. For example, Darwin emphasized the importance of competition between individuals of the same species to survive and reproduce, whereas Wallace placed an emphasis on local environmental pressures on varieties and species, which led to divergent populations in different locations. Yet these divergences are minor when compared with their clearly convergent positions on natural selection. Darwin later set out on the evidence for natural selection fully in his Variation of Animals and Plants under Domestication. Yet his realization that Wallace had come to more or less the same conclusions independently in 1858 spurred him to publish his ideas on evolution earlier than he intended. He had already written about 250,000 words of a large projected book on natural selection, and realized that he would have to produce something shorter and more focused if he was to gain a wider readership. In 1859, Darwin published on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. It is now universally known by the shorter title, The Origin of Species. In what follows, I will set out the core elements of its argument. Darwin begins by setting out three facts confirmed by extensive observation. Every species is fertile enough that if all offspring survived to reproduce, the population would become larger. Despite periodic fluctuations, populations remain roughly the same size. Resources such as food are limited and are relatively stable over time. From these facts, the following inference is then drawn: that a struggle for survival ensues, in that there are not enough resources to sustain all living forms. Both Darwin and Wallace had read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, which had emphasized that the population size was limited by resources. Darwin and Wallace both argued that living species were competing for limited resources, leading to a struggle for survival. Two further sets of observations are now woven into the argument. For these, Darwin drew on his knowledge of pigeon breeding. Individuals in a population vary significantly from one another. Much of this variation can be passed down from one generation to another, even though the mechanism for this was unclear. This led to Darwin to draw two further inferences. Individuals which are less suited or adapted to their environment are less likely to survive and hence less likely to reproduce. In contrast, individuals that are more suited to the environment are more likely to survive and hence are more likely to reproduce and leave their heritable traits to future generations. This is the filtering process that Darwin termed natural selection. This process, which proceeds over extended periods of time, results in populations changing to adapt to their environments, and these variations eventually accumulate over time to form new species. Darwin's Origin of Species went through 6 editions, and Darwin worked constantly to improve his text, adding new material, amending existing material, and above all, responding to criticisms. Some 60% of these modifications took place in the last 2 editions, which introduced some improvements that now seem unwise. For example, his incorporation of Herbert Spencer's potentially misleading phrase, the survival of the fittest. The contents of these successive editions of The Origin of Species make it clear that Darwin's new theory faced considerable opposition on many fronts. As we shall see, some Christian thinkers saw it as a threat to the way in which they had interpreted their faith. Yet other Christians saw Darwin's theory as offering new ways of understanding and parsing traditional Christian ideas. More importantly, Darwin's theory provoked scientific controversy, with many scientists of his day raising concerns about the scientific foundations of natural selection. If the successive editions of The Origin of Species are anything to go by, Darwin's theory appears to have met more sustained opposition from the scientific community than from its religious counterpart, especially on account of its failure to offer a convincing account of how innovations were transmitted to future generations. A good example of such scientific criticism is found in the concerns raised by Henry Charles Fleming-Jenkin about blending inheritance. Jenkin, sometime Regius Professor of Engineering at the University of Edinburgh, identified what Darwin clearly believed to be a potentially fatal inquiry flaw in his theory. He pointed out that on the basis of existing understandings of hereditary transmission, any novelties would be diluted in subsequent generations. Yet Darwin's theory depended on the transmission, not dilution, of such characteristics. In other words, Darwin's theory lacked a viable understanding of genetics. The answer, of course, lay in the writings of Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, later incorporated into what is sometimes known as the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. Mendel's theory of genetics made it clear that individual characteristics could be passed down from parents to offspring, yet that theoretical advance was unknown to Darwin or his critics at the time. Nevertheless, the fact that the characteristics were passed down from parents to offspring was well known, even though its mechanism was not understood. Darwin's appeal to the methods and outcomes of artificial selection among pigeons breeders connected well with his readership. For so much for the science, but what of its religious significance? Some popular writers, especially those sympathetic to the new atheism, suggest that Darwin's Origin of Species launched a new phase in the relation of science and religion, which of course they frame using the obsolete warfare narrative, with Darwin taking on the role of a bold atheist defender of truth against obstinate clerical creationists. The reality, as might be expected, is much more complex and interesting. First of all, let's look at Darwin's own religious views. These have been carefully studied by scholars and are reasonably well understood, especially when seen in the light of his Victorian text. Darwin's religious views changed over time, from the Christian orthodoxy of his period at Cambridge University through a form of deism around the time of publishing On the Origin of Species to an essentially agnostic position in later life. It is certainly true that Darwin's religious beliefs veered away from what we might loosely call Christian orthodoxy. Yet Darwin declined to be considered as an atheist. Furthermore, we do not find anything in Darwin remotely resembling the aggressive and ridiculing form of atheism characteristic of some of those who have presented themselves as his champions in more recent times. In his later life, Darwin remained respectful towards those who retained religious beliefs while expressing hostility toward any form of dogmatism, whether religious or atheist. What we do find in Darwin's work, particularly in his letters, is a specific critique of some aspects of Christianity which he clearly distinguishes from a more generic belief in God who governs the world through the laws of nature. Yet Darwin's misgivings about Christianity seems to have little to do with his new idea of natural selection or his theory of evolution in general. For Darwin, the problem was belief in divine providence. Some of his biographers have suggested that a crisis in Darwin's religious convictions came about as a result of the death of his daughter Annie in 1851 at the age of 10. Darwin was also concerned about the amount of suffering he saw in the natural world. While in South America, he witnessed at first hand the terrible struggle for existence faced by the natives of the Tierra del Fuego. As a biologist, he found himself uneasy about the violence and suffering entailed in the vicious natural food chain. Yet, despite his own waning personal religious beliefs, Darwin was empathic, and he did not see his evolutionary ideas as liable to cause legitimate difficulties for religious believers. Others may now interpret those ideas as causing religious discomfort or as entailing atheism, but Darwin himself did not see things this way. Darwin seems to have been willing not merely to go on recording concerning, but to emphasize the consilience of religious faith and theory of natural selection. In a letter of 1879, Darwin declared, "It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." He further added, even in his most extreme fluctuations, he had never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. In the same letter, he remarked that the most correct description of my state of mind, especially as he grew older, would be agnostic. One of the major themes in The Origin of Species is the notion of laws impressed on the matter by the Creator, which is actually given a higher profile in the second edition of the work than in the first. Darwin seems to have conceived of evolutionary law in the realm of biology as being analogous to gravitational law in the realm of astronomy. This is certainly suggested by the three highly significant quotations that Darwin placed before the main text of The Origin of Species. Two of these were present in the first edition, the third added in the second edition. These three citations are designed to framework Darwin's exposition of natural selection within a framework of natural laws. The first of these sentences is taken from the writings of William Whewell, a Cambridge philosopher of science. Events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. Whewell's words echo the widely accepted theological framework found in theologians such as Thomas Aquinas and scientists such as Isaac Newton, which held that God does not normally intervene in the natural order, but acts indirectly through the created laws of nature. This idea is clearly implicit in the Big Book on Natural Selection, on which Darwin worked from about 1858 to 1856 to 1858. By nature, I mean the laws ordained by God to govern the universe. The second quotation present from the second edition onward is taken from Joseph Butler's Analogy of Religion, a classic 18th century work of Anglican theology, affirming that God's actions can be considered as operating through the regular process of nature rather than as being superimposed upon it. What is natural as much requires and presupposes an intelligent agent to render it so. To effect it continually or at stated times, what is supernatural or miraculous does not affect it for once. The final quotation, taken from Roger Bacon's Advancement of Learning, appeals to the classic Renaissance image of the concealance of science and religion, the metaphor of the two books, the book of God's Word and the book of God's works. Nobody, Bacon declares, should think that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let men endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. One of the major achievements of Darwin's Origin of Species was to show how an explanation could be given for what he described as the mystery of mysteries, the successive appearance of new life forms that could be seen in the fossil record. If new species could emerge from pre-existing species by a process of natural selection, it was no longer necessary to suppose that occurrence of what Darwin called as independent actions of creation. Darwin developed his theory in terms of laws impressed upon matter by the Creator. Rather than individual divine actions of creation, the dominant form of Christianity in England in Darwin's time was the established Church of England, which was a powerful presence within the academic and cultural world of the day. It soon became clear that many of its senior figures were supportive of Darwin's ideas, seeing evolution as God's preferred method for bringing biological diversity into being. One such figure was the novelist and Christian social reformer Charles Kingsley, to whom Darwin refers as a celebrated author and divine. Knowing of his interest in the topic, Darwin sent Kingsley an advanced copy of The Origin of Species a week before its publication. Kingsley wrote back to Darwin to express his delight at the work, making a theological judgment that would resonate with many within the Church. It was, he declared, just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development as it was to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the loudness which he himself had made. Kingsley declared that he, like Darwin and many others, had learned to disbelieve the dogma of the permanence of species, which he considered to be contradicted by the intelligent observation of nature, particularly the development of new forms of plants and animals through selective breeding for agricultural purposes. In an 1871 lecture, Kingsley, by then a canon of Westminster Abbey, a citadel of the religious establishment, argued that the word creation implies a process as much as an event. Darwin's theory had clarified the mechanism of creation, We knew of old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold, he is so much wiser than even that he can make all things make themselves. Where Paley thought of a static creation, Kingsley argued that Darwin made it possible to see creation as a dynamic process directed by divine providence. Instead of a chilling dream of a dead universe ungoverned by an absent God, Kingsley declared that Darwinism, when rightly interpreted, offered a vision of a living universe, constantly improving under the wise direction of its benevolent creator. Of old it was said by him, without whom nothing is made, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Shall we quarrel with science if she should show how those words are true? This approach was later widely adopted by senior churchmen. This warm ecclesiastical endorsement of Darwin continued to his death. Although Darwin wanted to be buried near his home, it was eventually arranged that he would be buried in Westminster Abbey. Many readers, however, will find such a warm reception for Darwin's ideas from senior clergy of the Church of England puzzling. After all, was one of the church bishops, Samuel Wilberforce, not a vicious and ignorant opponent of Darwin? This naturally brings us to consider one of the great legends of the warfare narrative of science and religion, the debate between Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas H. Huxley at Oxford in 1860. The myth that science and religion are permanently at war with each other is often justified through an appeal to the meeting of the British Association in Oxford on June 30th, 1860, which pitted Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, against biologist Thomas H. Huxley on the topic of Darwin's theory of evolution. A generation later, this debate was propelled to iconic status as a classic example of the warfare between science and religion. However, recently historians have offered a much more informed and balanced account of the meeting, which is now seen in a very different light. The popular image of Huxley's triumphant defeat of a reactionary religious opponent of evolution is now generally seen as a myth created by the opponents of organized religion in the 1890s. This revisionist account of the meeting does not deny its historical faculty or factuality. The new research calls into question overblown and inaccurate accounts of its significance and offers an informed reconstruction of the debate which accounts better for the historical evidence at our disposal. The British Association for the Advancement of Science was scheduled to meet in Oxford in 1860, as Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had been published the previous year. It was natural that it should be a subject of discussion at the 1860 meeting. Darwin himself was in poor health and was unable to attend the meeting. Huxley, then a young man, was invited in his place. Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, was also invited to speak. He had been vice president of the British Association in the past and was known to be familiar with Darwin's ideas and writings. Although he was Bishop of Oxford at the time, he was not present as a representative of the Church of England at this meeting. In his address, Wilberforce set out the main themes of Darwin's work, emphasizing that the British Association discussion was about science, not religion. In his extended review of Darwin's Origin of Species, published in the Quarterly Review in the same month, with those who object to any facts or alleged facts in nature, or to any inference logically deduced from them, because they believe them to contradict what appeared to them is taught by a revelation. According to a popular legend that is regularly and uncritically reproduced in many older biographies of Darwin, Wilberforce attempted to pour scorn on the theory of evolution by suggesting that it implied that humans were recently descended from monkeys. Would Huxley, he asked, prefer to think of himself being descended from an ape on his grandfather or grandmother's side? He was then duly rebuked by Huxley, who turned the tables on him, showing him to be an ignorant and arrogant cleric. Even the BBC perpetuated this nonsense in the 1970s, representing a young, handsome, heroic Huxley triumphing over a sulky and villainous Wilberforce. The classic formulation of this legendary demonization of Wilberforce debate dates from 1898 and takes the form of an autobiographical memory from Mrs. Isabella Sidgwick, published in Macmillan's magazine. This idiosyncratic account is inconsistent with most accounts published or in circulation closer to the time of the meeting itself, nearly 40 years earlier, raising some awkward questions about the reliability of Mrs. Sedgwick's memory. A review published shortly after the British Association event in the Athenaeum expressed the consensus of 1860. Wilberforce and Huxley, it declared, have been found foemen worthy of their steel, and made their charges and countercharges very much to their own satisfaction and the delight of their respective friends. It is quite clear from Wilberforce's careful and insightful published review of Darwin's Origin of Species that religious issues did not feature prominently in his mind. The issue was the scientific case for evolution, not its religious implications or complications. The fact that Wilberforce was Bishop of Oxford had clearly led many to conclude that religion was at the forefront of the debate and that Wilberforce opposed Darwin on religious grounds. The evidence does not support this interpretation of events. The debate was primarily about the scientific merits of Darwin's theory, and Wilberforce, who, it must be noted, was actually present in his capacity as a former vice president of the association, not as a bishop of the Church of England, was clearly well informed about the matter. Darwin himself remarked, after reading Wilberforce's review of his work, that it was uncommonly clever. It picks out with skill all the most conjectural parts and brings forward well all the difficulties. Furthermore, recent scholarship has suggested that the real debate at the time was not between science and religion, but between two quite distinct divisions of science, one defined by naturalist assumptions and the other more open to theistic beliefs. Yet there is another point about this Oxford meeting of 1860 which has generally been overlooked. On Sunday, July 1st, the day after the confrontation between Wilberforce and Huxley, the conference delegates heard a sermon preached on the theme of the present relations of science to religion. The preacher was Frederick Temple, who had strong local connections and good scientific credibility. He had been a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford, and had gone to be the headmaster of Rugby School, where he had established scholarships in natural science and was in the process of planning a school science laboratory. Temple did not comment on the debate of the previous day, but instead praised scientists for trying to discover as much as possible about the structures of the laws of the universe, within which the finger of God might be discerned. The harmony between science, superficial, petty details of facts, but at a more profound level. This harmony was at the level of a deep identity of tone, character, and spirit between spiritual scripture and nature, a relationship traditionally expressed using the two books metaphor. Temple was a rising star in the ecclesiastical firmament and went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury. He confirmed what was now emerging as the preferred ecclesiastical framing of Darwin's ideas. As he declared in some Oxford lectures of 1884, God did not make the things we may say no, but he made them make themselves. This is not to say that there were no religious concerns about Darwin's ideas, and that many, including Charles Kingsley, had difficulties with the notion of the continuity that Darwin's theory seemed to imply between humans and their animal ancestors, something that was hinted at the Origin of Species, but was not dated more explicitly until the Descent of Man. Yet this does not amount to an uncritical rejection of the theory. It was simply recognition that there were further questions that needed to be explored, some scientific, some religious, some ethical. Darwin's theory of evolution was adopted by those with progressive political agendas, particularly the improvement of the human race. It is not difficult to understand Darwin's appeal to social progressives of the age. If Darwin allows us to understand the mechanism of evolution, might we be able to use the understanding to improve the quality of humanity, or at least to prevent certain defective human beings from being born? These are contentious issues which will raise concerns for many readers, yet we must consider how Darwin's insights were applied by his successors, whether rightly or wrongly. The first major attempt to apply Darwinian insights to safeguarding the human future was the eugenics movement, which emerged in the first half of the 20th century. The scientific basis of this movement seemed to be unassailable. Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, had noted the implications of Darwin's theory of natural selection and influenced a significant passage in The Descent of Man, which laid the foundation for eugenics. Darwin noted that with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. Civilized societies, however, inhibit this process of elimination through medical and social care, thus enabling the weak members of civilized societies to propagate their kind. Darwin saw this as injurious to the future of the human race. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race, but excepting in the case of man himself. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Darwin's implicit support of the notion of selective breeding for humans, paralleling the best practices of stock breeders, was one of many factors which led to eugenics becoming increasingly influential with Victorian culture. Since the process of genetic transmission and evolution was now understood, why should it not be applied to ensure the future of the British Empire? Galton argued that breeding should be limited to those possessing eugenic value qualities which seem remarkably close to the virtues and values of Victorian England. Galton's proposals included the suggestion that extra credit should be given for family merit in competitive examination for the civil services or other professional posts if the candidate had superior breeding potential, as judged by the success of family members in their chosen professions. He also recommended that the requirement for celibacy for fellows at Oxford and Cambridge universities should be abolished, since these intelligent males could be expected to have superior offspring and thus ought to be encouraged to breed. It soon became clear that there was a darker side to eugenics. Galton's science quickly became the victims of politics and prejudice. Normative judgments about eugenic value soon extended to race and social class. Some argued for a form of scientific racism, holding that the Negro was less biologically advanced than the Mongolian or the European. For such reasons, some argued that certain undesirable social groups should be prohibited from reproducing, although this problem was especially pronounced in the case of Adolf Hitler's racial policies of the 1930s. Many progressive and liberal thinkers of that period, both in Great Britain and the United States, argued for the forcible sterilization of the individuals or social groups deemed to have limited eugenic value. While such acts could arguably be given some scientific justification, the chief difficulty was that eugenic value was all too often defined in terms of class, race, or creed. In effect, self-appointed social in-groups sought to prevent out-groups from reproducing. In England, Marie Stopes founded the Society for Constructed Birth Control and Racial Progress to promote eugenic birth control in 1921. Stopes' book, Radiant Motherhood, reflected the consensus then emerging within British progressive circles. Its final chapter, entitled A New and Irradiated Race, advocated sterilization as a means of preventing the rotten and racially diseased from endangering the higher and more beautiful forms of the human race. Stopes framed her vision of the enforced sterilization of those lacking eugenic value in terms of ensuring the beauty of the race. The evolution of humanity will take a leap forward when we have around us only fine and beautiful young people. This final chapter of Radiant Motherhood needs to be carefully read, not least because it provides important insights into the racial and class prejudices of the British cultural elite of the 1920s, who felt themselves threatened by a growing working class. If the good in our race is not to be swamped and destroyed as the fruit tree by the parasite, this prolific depravity must be curbed. Although seen as progressive during the 1920s, eugenics is now widely regarded as a failed amalgam of Darwinian ideas with transient social and political agendas. This is not a criticism of science nor of Darwin's ideas, although many will feel uneasy with Darwin's implied criticism of public health care. It is a reminder of the way in which science can be abused by those in power and redirected toward political goals. Above all, it undermines any suggestion that science is necessarily associated with liberal values. History tells us otherwise, and we cannot ignore it. So what questions might Darwin's theory of evolution raise for religion, particularly with Christianity? Let's consider these in the next section. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, and Descent of Man, gave rise to significant cultural debates, with attention often focusing on the place and status of human beings in a Darwinian world. There were unquestionably religious elements to those debates, but it would be a serious misjudgment to think that they solely or mainly concern religion. Darwin's views on the evolutionary origins of humanity had enormous social, political, ethical, and religious implications, which left many wondering how to make sense of this strange new world, in which human beings seem to have been relocated conceptually. Some of the most perceptive explorations of these concerns are found in the novels and poetry of the late Victorian age rather than more technical writings. In his Lucretius, Alfred Lord Tennyson offers a somewhat grim view of the implications of Darwinism, portraying the Roman philosopher's materialism and his increasingly awareness of his own animalistic desires as ultimately driving him to suicide. George Meredith offers a radically different take on the matter in his Ode to the Spirit of Earth and Autumn, embracing the prospect of a new paganism in which human beings could aspect their place as an empirical part of nature while living out their biological nature to the full. There are three major themes that emerge from Darwin's ideas, which create tensions from some traditional religious beliefs, including those of Christianity. In what follows, we shall note these briefly. Our concern here is not so much with the historical debates of the Victorian era, but with their counterparts in the 21st century. Darwinism offers a materialist understanding of human nature. One of the most distinctive and central themes of Darwin's Descent of Man is that man is descended from some lowly organized form. Human beings are to be understood as participants within rather than merely observers of the evolutionary process. Perhaps influenced by the ideology of progress that was so characteristic of his age, Darwin saw this as eliciting hope for the future. Man may be excused for feeling some pride at having risen, though not through his own exertions, to the very summit of the organic scale, and the fact of his having thus risen, instead of having been aboriginally placed there, may give him hopes for a still higher destiny in the distant future. Man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Such a recognition of the evolutionary links between humanity and the animal kingdom causes the human to appear more animal and the animal to appear more human. Within Darwin's theoretical framework, though not within Lamarck's, human beings cannot in any sense be said to be either the goal or the apex of evolution. From a religious point of view, this raised a number of concerns, perhaps most notably the traditional belief that human beings alone possess immortal souls. We shall consider this question in more detail in the following chapter. Yet this belief goes way beyond religion. Most Darwinists would insist that it is corollary of an evolutionary worldview that we must recognize that we are animals, part of the evolutionary process. Darwinism thus critiques the absolutist assumptions concerning the place of humanity within nature that lies behind speciesism, a somewhat cumbersome term introduced by Richard Ryder and given wider currency by Peter Singer, currently of Princeton University. This critique has raised awkward questions far beyond the realm of traditional religion, in that many political and ethical theories are predicated on the assumption of the privileged status of humanity within nature, whether this is justified on religious or secular grounds. We shall explore some of these themes in the next chapter, which reflects further on the relation of scientific and religious accounts of human nature. Let's look at a specifically religious issue which arises from Darwin's theories. God is eliminated from the world. A common religious concern is that Darwin's evolutionary theory led to the elimination of God from any role within the world. It does not require divine action in order for it to take place, and the random nature of variation is inconsistent with the idea of divine creation and providence, which are linked with the ideas of divine purpose and intentionality. Richard Dawkins thus argues that Darwin's theory renders belief in God superfluous. Many conservative Protestant writers agree, arguing that the role attributed to random events is inconsistent with the biblical material. Creationist writers often consider this one of the most important elements of their critique of Darwinism. However, the force of this point is open to question. B.B. Warfield, perhaps one of the most influential conservative Protestant theologians of the late 19th century, pointed out that evolution could easily be understood as a seemingly random process, which was nevertheless divinely superintended. God's providence, he argued, could be seen as directing the evolutionary process toward its intended goals. Warfield, seen by some as the founder of an inerrantist view of the Bible, also pointed out that if a way of interpreting the Bible was in conflict with science, it might be because that way of understanding this text was wrong and needed review. While some would see this as a weak accommodationist argument, Warfield wanted to acknowledge that biblical interpretation needed to take science into account. Some Anglican writers of the late Victorian era took a very different approach, holding that Darwin liberated Christianity from a cold and arid deist idea of God as a watchmaker popularized by William Paley and others. 19th century Anglican theologian Aubrey Moore famously argued that under the guise of a foe, Darwin had done Christianity the work of a friend. How? By liberating it from this defective vision of God. Yet the most widely proposed mechanism which Christian writers have put forward to account um, for God's involvement in the evolutionary process is the classic notion of secondary causality, particularly as this was developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. For Aquinas, God's causality operates in a number of ways. While God must be considered capable of doing certain things directly, God delegates causal efficacy to the created order. Aquinas understands this notion of secondary causality to be an extension of, not an alternative to, the primary causality of God. Events within the created order can exist in complex causal relationships without in any way denying their ultimate dependency upon God as final cause. The created order thus demonstrates causal relationships which can be investigated by the natural sciences. Those causal relationships can be investigated and correlated. For example, in the form of the laws of nature, without in any way implying, still less necessitating an atheist worldview, God created a world with its own ordering and processes. Aquinas, in effect, offers a more rigorous framework for exploring the insight of Charles Kingsley. God can make all things make theories impacted on a religious question which was particularly significant for Christians and Jews, the interpretation of the early chapters in the book of Genesis, which speak of the creation of the world and humanity. Some popular Christian writers of the 17th century interpret this text as implying that God created the world and human beings about 6,000 years ago, one famous suggestion being 4004 BC. In fact, the biblical narratives give no chronology for the act of creation. This figure depends on some very speculative mathematics and creative interpretations of the biblical texts. By the middle of the 18th century, geological data had made it clear that the Earth was much more older than a few thousand years. In some ways, the problem was that some Christians of the Victorian age were reading the Bible naively, as if it were a science textbook, failing to realize the complexity of its language, the theological intentions of its authors, or the literary conventions of its context. Early Christian writers of the 4th and 5th centuries were much more sensitive to this complexity, reading Genesis as a literary text with a theological message to convey. Core elements of that theological message included the idea that there is one creator God, who made all things that exist, that the material creation is good, not evil, and that human beings have a special place in this creation, including a responsibility to take care of the created order. Despite the fact that sermons were one of the most important means of exploring the interface of science and religion during the Victorian age, few preachers engaged Darwin or his ideas seriously. Indeed, many popular English preachers of the early 19th century treated Genesis in a crudely literal manner, seeing it as using straightforward descriptive prose to convey a factual scientific message about the chronology of the world. This tendency developed further within American Protestant fundamentalism, which holds to a literal reading of the Genesis text. Fundamentalists argue that the best weapon against what they regard as bad science is good science, that is, science based on a literal and factual reading of Genesis. This view, which involves reading the Bible as a scientific textbook rather than as a religious text, has now come to be known as creationism. The rise of various forms of creationism in the United States and elsewhere is a relatively recent development, dating from more than a century after Darwin's Origin of Species. It is normally tracked back to a single book, The Genesis Flood. This work, written by two American fundamentalists, John C. White and Henry M. Morse, laid the foundations for what was improperly called scientific creationism. Unlike traditional Christian understandings of creation, this movement develops its thinking within a polemical framework, failing to make any distinction between the languages and approaches of theology and science. For reflective Christians, it is important to appreciate that there are alternative models to thinking about the issues within the long tradition of reflection on the Bible, models which can easily be reappropriated today. A good example is the approach to the interpretation of the Genesis creation narratives developed by Augustine of Hippo 1,000 years before the scientific revolution of our modern period and 1,500 years before Darwin's Origin of Species. There is no way in which Augustine can be considered to have accommodated his biblical interpretation in order to fit in new theories about the Big Bang or natural selection. Augustine's classic work on the literal meaning of Genesis, written between 401 and 415, was intended to be a literal commentary on the text. Literal here means something along the lines of, in the sense intended by the author. This traditional, that is, ancient, way of reading Genesis predates by more than a millennium the literal readings of this text, which became characteristic of English-speaking Protestantism in the 18th and 19th centuries. For Augustine, the natural meaning of the Genesis creation accounts is that God brought everything into existence in a single moment of creation. Yet the created order is not static, in that God endowed it with the capacity to develop. Augustine uses the image of a dormant seed to help his readers grasp this point. God creates seeds which will grow and develop at the right time. Using more technical language, Augustine asks his readers to think of created order as containing divinely embedded casualties which emerge or evolve at a later stage. Yet Augustine has no time for any notion of random or arbitrary change of knowledge of their intellectual heritage. Their response to the challenge of Darwinism would have been more interesting, constructive, and productive. In this chapter, I have looked at some of the issues that arise from evolutionary thought. There is much more that needs to be said about these issues. Much. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay. Well, there's that chapter. Still, my mind's like blown away. Like, I don't know. And this is just totally amazing. I mean, I think what's totally amazing about this is that it's trying to find common ground with science and religion. Just like religion is trying to find common ground with other religions. Like the Book of Joy that I'm going to read at some point. It won't be the next book I read, but it will definitely be a book. But yeah, so that's the video there. Tomorrow I will be reading chapter 6 called Souls on Being Human. And yeah, so there you have it. I hope you guys have a good rest of your week. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and always thanks for watching. Rum rum.